Hello, everyone. Welcome to the, well, I say Friday night live, but it's more like a sort of Friday late afternoon, early evening live. Apologies, I got my scheduling slightly mixed up this week, so I had to move it to a bit earlier. But of course, it will be available in the Facebook group and on the YouTube channel afterwards anyway. I didn't have that many questions this week, so I thought I'd talk about a couple of bits that I thought might be interesting anyway. Because I suppose it's the same people a lot of the time who watch the lives, and rather keep putting you to the effort of inventing questions when we've talked about a lot of things anyway, I thought maybe I'd take the initiative to come up with a few new things. One of which I think is quite interesting, and I wanted to talk about the concept of drag. Um, when I use the word, just to confirm, I'm not using it as men dressing up in women's clothes. I'm using it more in its aerodynamic sense, in the sense of a force that acts opposite to the forward motion of an object. So when a car drives forward very quickly, or an aeroplane, the air acts against it to kind of hold it back. And the reason I use that in relation to alcohol is because I think there's a few areas, in fact, there's 5 specific areas where alcohol acts as a drag. Obviously, there's lots and lots of areas, but the reason I'm identifying 5 in particular is because they affect every single drinker on the planet, even those people who have a small glass of red wine once a week, or if there is anyone genuinely like that. So that's why I think it's quite interesting, because I think that one of the problems with alcohol is, firstly, people work on the assumption that if you're just having one or two, you get the good without the bad. Not only does that tempt a lot of people to start drinking, but it's kind of that ridiculous concept about moderation as well. People think if then they can cut down, they somehow get all the good with none of the bad. So I thought it was worth just running through this concept. So these are the ways in which alcohol on a day-to-day level acts as a drag, a force acting opposite to your forward motion. There's 5 things I've identified, which I'll talk about: sleep, heart rate, fitness, weight, and anxiety. Okay. As ever, the key, and I know I talk about this every week, but it is really the crux, the main part from which everything else, or virtually everything else, springs from, is the physiological effects of alcohol. So alcohol is a sedative and an anesthetic, which means it acts as a chemical depressant, which means it is something that decreases or inhibits nerve activity. Now, the problem is that the human brain has its own array of chemicals, drugs, and hormones, and it manufactures and releases these in such a way that, well, it's what's known as homeostasis, which is essentially a very, very delicate chemical balance. Now, when that chemical balance is all in place, you feel generally positive, resilient, and capable. When you start interfering with that chemical balance, that's when you can start to feel out of sorts, anxious, timid, and generally unable to cope with things. So when we take a depressant, a sedative like alcohol, our brain reacts to it in lots and lots of different ways. But what it amounts to is it becomes oversensitive, so it can work under the sedating effects of the alcohol. It releases things like adrenaline, which you've heard of, and cortisol, which are stress hormones, which basically try in an attempt to counter the sedating effects of the alcohol. Of course, the problem is when the alcohol wears off, there's a corresponding feeling of anxiety. It's like when you drink too much caffeine and you feel a bit tense, a bit out of sorts, you can't concentrate on things properly, and you just don't feel particularly good. Now, there's 2 ways you can get rid of that feeling. One way is just to give it a bit of time, and eventually your brain chemistry gets back to normal. But a far quicker way of getting rid of it is to take another drink. because in taking another drink, you're redressing the chemical balance. Your brain's geared up to work under the sedating effects of the alcohol, but without the alcohol, it's running ahead and jumping all over the place. So when you replace the alcohol, you feel a lot better, but only because you're addressing a chemical balance that's been caused previously. A lot of people struggle with this concept because, obviously, taken to its logical conclusion, it means that anyone who's ever had an alcoholic drink suffers from withdrawal. Okay, but actually they do. If you've never drunk before and you just have a few sips of red wine, there will be a withdrawal. It will just be so minor as to be virtually imperceptible. Your brain becomes more and more proficient over the years at countering the alcohol. So you need to drink more to get the same effect. You're able to drink more, and that's what tolerance is. And of course, when the alcohol wears off, you feel worse, so the withdrawal gets worse. So over time, things get progressively worse. But indeed, everyone does suffer from alcohol withdrawal. Think of it this way: alcohol or any withdrawal is an unpleasant feeling caused by a chemical imbalance that is itself caused by the previous dose of the drug. In which case, that anxiety you get when you've been drinking is absolutely alcohol withdrawal. So having got that concept in place, let's look at the first of these 5 ways in which alcohol creates a drag on, and I emphasize this, it is every single drinker. Okay, it's not just people who supposedly have a problem with it, it's everyone who's ever taken an alcoholic drink. Now, we've talked about sleep many times, but I keep talking about it because I think it's so important, and I don't think you can talk about it enough. Sleep is not about just falling unconscious for a few hours and then waking up and being good to go. When you sleep, you go through some very specific sleep cycles. Now, there's a lot we humans don't fully understand about sleep, but what we do know is that the main differentiating factor between these different sleep cycles is how deeply unconscious you are. So there is a sleep cycle called deep sleep, where, as you would expect, you're very deeply unconscious. But at the other end of the scale, there's something called REM sleep, which is when they've put sensors on people and monitored them through REM sleep, their brain lights up almost as if they're fully awake. So it's a very unusual sleep cycle. Your brain, it's almost as if you're fully awake. That's where we dream. Again, we don't really understand what dreams are about, but this REM sleep is crucial. On tests with rats, they've starved them of REM sleep, and they've been dead within a few weeks. They've tried similar tests on people where they've monitored them, and when they go into REM sleep, they wake them up. These people become very depressed, very anxious, and very unhappy. And most people don't complete the test. They can't go through with it. They just drop out. So we don't understand much about it, but it is a crucial sleep cycle. Now, if most natural sleepers will go through, I think, 6 or 7 rounds of REM sleep, drinkers on average only 2. Now, the reason for that is in the first part of the night, they are too heavily sedated for their brain to take them into that higher conscious, if you like, sleep cycle, REM, because they've been sedated. And of course, after about 5 hours after your last drink, the overstimulation kicks in, so you can't sleep at all. So going back to what I said before, it's like drinking too much caffeine. It's like taking a stimulant. You might be absolutely exhausted and desperate to sleep, but after usually that 5-hour mark, that's when you wake up and you can't get back to sleep. That's why people find they wake up at 3 or 4 in the morning feeling really tense and anxious and can't get back to sleep. It's the alcohol withdrawal. The more you drink, the more alcohol will impact your sleep, but even 1 or 2 drinks will interrupt your normal sleeping pattern. Okay, so every drinker is not experiencing the proper sleep cycles that they need in order to wake up feeling at their best. Okay, and again, I can't emphasize this enough. This impacts every single drinker. I can't tell you how many times, people have said, "Oh, how are you feeling this morning?" "Oh, I'm fine. I just feel a bit tired." That's because of the alcohol. That's the alcohol you drink the night before. It makes you tired because it prevents you from being able to go through the sleep cycles you need to go through in order to feel at your best. The second of the ways I want to talk about how alcohol acts as a drag is to do with heart rate. Now, because your body reacts to the sedating effects of alcohol by dumping a load of stress hormones and stimulants into you to try and counter the sedating effects of the alcohol, your heart rate goes up. Okay. And if anyone out there, and lots of people do these days, wears one of these fitness trackers and they're drinking, look at what it does to your heart rate. It pushes your heart rate up quite dramatically. In fact, a lot of these actually measure sleep as well. So you can see how alcohol affects your sleep, but it pushes your heart rate up. Now, when your heart rate goes up, you feel tired and you want to sit down. It's a fail-safe mechanism by your body to stop you from overdoing things and causing a problem. This is why exercise is difficult. When you're doing it, you want to stop doing it because your heart rate goes up and up and up and up. And the more it goes up, the more your body is telling, your brain is saying to you, stop, sit down and rest. So when you take any drug like alcohol that increases your heart rate, your energy levels drop dramatically. So not only do you feel lethargic because you're tired, but you feel doubly lethargic because your heart rate goes up. And again, even small doses of alcohol will increase your heart rate. Obviously, the more you drink, the quicker your heart is beating. But even small amounts of alcohol, I've got a fly here, even small amounts of alcohol increase your heart rate. So every drinker is experiencing this to a greater or lesser degree. The next thing I want to talk about is fitness, and it ties in very much to the heart rate. Um, One of the key indicators of fitness, rather interestingly, is blood composition, because when your muscles work a lot, well, in fact, muscles need oxygen. The faster and more they work, the more oxygen they need. The oxygen reaches your muscles by being carried to them through the blood in the red blood cells. So your blood contains red blood cells, and these carry oxygen. It picks the oxygen up from your lungs and carries it around your bloodstream to the muscles. So the more your muscles are working, the more oxygen they need. So the quicker your heart pumps to get those red blood cells through your body to carry oxygen. That's why your heart speeds up when you're exercising. Now, when you exercise regularly, and remember, human beings, all living things are great adapters. When you exercise regularly, your blood undergoes two important changes. Firstly, the red blood cells are taken out of circulation earlier. Now, how this makes an impact is the younger the blood cell, the more oxygen it can carry. So fitter people, their red blood cells are taken out of circulation earlier. So the blood cells that are in their body can actually carry more oxygen. The second change is there's a greater concentration of blood cells in their blood. So fitter people have more red blood cells. What this actually means in practice is every beat of the heart carries more oxygen to the muscles, because each blood cell is carrying more oxygen, and every, I don't know, milliliter of blood is carrying a lot more blood cells in it. So more oxygen is getting to the muscles. Now, that's the process of getting fit, but you can actually reverse it, because if you speed your heart rate up without associated physical activity, you reverse the process. So if you speed your heart rate up with physical activity, i.e., exercise, your blood changes so that you become fitter, okay, by the age of your blood cells dropping and the concentration growing. Okay. But if you are increasing your heart rate without any physical activity, the opposite happens, because your heart rate goes up, but your muscles aren't actually using any oxygen. So there's too much oxygen going around. So it just drops off. The age of the blood cells increases and the concentration starts to decrease. It's just your body's way of reacting to things. So actually drinking is like the opposite of exercising. It has a reverse effect to exercising because of that increased heart rate. And the same is true for any other drug that increases your heart rate. Um, The reason why this acts as a day-to-day drag is because when you are feeling fit, you generally feel more positive and resilient, and the less fit you feel, the less resilient and the less positive you feel. So that's the third way in that alcohol in the third way that alcohol creates a drag, i.e., it holds people back. And again, to emphasize yet again, this is true for every single drinker. Obviously, the more you drink, the worse the effect is, but no one gets away with it scot-free. The fourth of the 5 ways is weight. Okay, because the more weight you're carrying, the harder it is to move. It is that simple. Alcohol affects people's weight in several different ways. Firstly, alcohol tastes foul. Okay, and if you're in any doubt about that, get some neat 100% alcohol and see if it smells and tastes appetizing. Well, you don't need to do that because I can tell you for a fact it doesn't. It's absolutely vile. So the only way we can consume it is to mix in a lot of sugary substances. So to consume this drug, it's not like smoking where you can consume it without taking on any calories. To take the drug alcohol, you take in a huge amount of completely empty calories just to get to the drug. That's the most obvious way. Secondly, alcohol is an appetite stimulant. Now, it might seem counterintuitive to talk about alcohol being a stimulant when I've already explained that it's a sedative, it's a depressant, so it's the opposite of a stimulant. But actually, when we start to understand a bit more about digestion, it starts to make sense. Because when you eat something, that food has to go through something like 20 foot of digestive tract. Now, for the vast majority of that, there are muscles that squeeze it through your intestines. So actually, eating takes up a huge amount of energy. So your body usually likes to make you eat when you are relaxing. And it tries to stop you eating when you're likely to be moving around or exercising or doing something physical. This is why stimulants like amphetamines reduce your appetite, because when you take a stimulant, your body reduces your hunger. And the converse is true. When you sit down and rest, your appetite starts to go up because your body thinks there's nothing going on at the moment. Now would be a good time to eat because I've got the physical energy to direct towards digestion. So when you take something like alcohol that is a sedative, it actually increases your appetite. So when you drink alcohol, you find you're hungrier, you can eat more, because it creates this false appetite. Um, the other thing, of course, it does is because it's an anesthetic, it anesthetizes the receptors that tell you you're full. So not only do you want to eat more, but you're much more capable of overeating. There's another part, dopamine. People often associate dopamine with addiction, and they confuse it with endorphins. Endorphins make you feel good. Dopamine is a motivator. It makes you feel like you need to be doing something. This is why a lot of people wake up hungry when they've been eating. It's actually the dopamine. Your body releases dopamine because it's a motivator. It's like a stimulant to counteract. It's one of the many things it releases to counteract the sedating effects of the alcohol. So even when the alcohol's worn off, you find you can be additionally hungry the next day because of the dopamine. Another way that alcohol causes people to gravitate towards being overweight is it prevents the absorption of certain key nutrients like B vitamins and zinc. Now, your body triggers feelings of hunger not just when you are low on available energy, i.e., calories, but also when you're low on vitamins or minerals that you need. So, if you are a regular drinker, you will be low in certain B vitamins and zinc because alcohol actually inhibits your body from being able to absorb them, with the result that you can end up with this almost constant hunger because your body's constantly trying to make you eat to get these vitamins in, but the alcohol is preventing you from absorbing them. The other problem that comes in because alcohol is a drug that we consume by drinking as opposed to injecting or snorting or smoking is when you drink a liquid and you urinate, you wash out small amounts of salt. Okay, it's usually not a problem because you're thirsty, you drink, you stop being thirsty, you don't drink, and everything's fine. But when you suddenly knock back an extra 2, 3, 4, 5 drinks, particularly if it's pints of beer, like larger volumes of liquid, you wash out quite a lot of salt, which is why you then have salt cravings. And what foods are high in salt? Chips, kebabs, pizzas, cheese, all of these fast foods that are, not particularly nutritious, and very high in fat and calories. So that's why you get another reason why you get these cravings for, poor quality food. It's because you're washing out the salt. We've touched on fitness, which obviously has an impact as well, because obviously if you've got energy, you're taking on all these extra calories, but you're not burning them off because you're not feeling fit enough, and you've got that lethargy, and you're tired and all the rest of it. And the final point is, and this is mainly is for men, alcohol reduces testosterone. So when you drink, men who drink have low testosterone, and it keeps testosterone low for about 4 or 5 days. So even if you're not a daily drinker, you just drink at weekends, your testosterone is consistently low. And low testosterone is linked to decreased bone mass, decreased muscle mass, obesity, loss of hair, depression, and again, fatigue. So all of these ways in which alcohol affects us and causes, a day-to-day drag on us. And of course, the last one, when alcohol wears off, it leaves a corresponding feeling of anxiety, and that anxiety hangs around for 24, 36 hours. So, and again, I do emphasize, if you're having a glass of wine, it's going to be significantly less, but it is still there. This is something that every drinker has to put up with. So I hope that's interesting. I found it interesting purely because this is stuff that affects everyone. And the days of people thinking that, oh, I only have a couple, it's all good. Well, it isn't at all. You're still affecting yourself massively. And I haven't even spoken here about, the increased cancer risk, because alcohol is a carcinogen. And classified by the World Health Organization in the same class 1 carcinogen, along with cigarette smoking and asbestos. I was trying to concentrate here only on the actual day-to-day effects, because for a lot of people, the fact that it might increase their cancer risk in 20 years' time is less relevant than the fact that they feel rubbish in the here and now. So I hope that was interesting. I thought I'd share that with you, even though I haven't got too many questions, but I will move on to the questions now. One of which is, can you touch on some of the symptoms of pause? As someone who's dropped 2 different substances in the last 200 days, I feel that there could be more press on the topic. And then I read that as I've dropped 2 different substances. So I thought they'd been taken 2 different drugs, as in dropped, as in consumed. So I asked for clarification and was told no, as in I've quit 2 separate substances. And then someone else actually asked, can pause last up to 2 years? So let me explain what pause is. It's post-acute withdrawal syndrome. And what that means is, obviously, you quit alcohol and you expect to have withdrawal for, 3 or 4, up to 5 days. There's actually another period after that where you start to feel really tired. That's kind of like an hangover of the original withdrawal period. But mostly the withdrawal only lasts, for most people, a day or two, the actual physical. And in worst cases, it can go on a bit longer than that. But what post-acute withdrawal syndrome is the idea that, and it's incredibly vague, but it's anything within, I think, a few months up to a year or two, that you can suddenly have this additional withdrawal. Now, it's not very well documented, in that a lot of people have reported it to such an extent that it is a thing and it has got a name, but the symptoms are quite vague. So it's kind of like restlessness, insomnia, mild depression or anxiety. And also the time periods are quite vague. So that, I think, pretty much summarizes up what it is and what is known about it. Um, I didn't suffer from it, and I know a lot of other people who hasn't suffered from it. And I think the problem is the symptoms could as easily be psychological as physical. And I don't mean that in a disparaging way, but as we all know, and I've talked about several times, when you quit alcohol, your life is immeasurably better. Your brain chemistry gets back to normal. You're sleeping better. Your fitness starts to go up. You start to feel a lot better. You start to feel better than you ever did when you are drinking, even when you're actually drinking. And that's about the best you feel when you're drinking. But the problem is we humans are very good at taking things for granted. So the cycle you often see is people quit, they're worried, they're anxious, they're going through the withdrawal, it's all very difficult and unpleasant. But then they get through that stage, they maybe get a weekend or two under their belt and start to think, hang on, I can do this. And then they start to feel really good. And then they really start to warm to it. This is not true for everyone. Everyone is different, but this is a cycle for a lot of people. And this is what's called the pink cloud. It's basically those early days of sobriety where you just realize how much better you feel. Now, the problem is we humans tend to take things for granted. So waking up feeling great after a short or long period of time is no longer a bonus or something wonderful and something to be cherished. It's the norm. So waking up feeling good is just how we feel all the time. And we start to take it for granted. But on the other hand, we're still being bombarded on social media, on TV, in films, in TV programs, in books, in music by that, that highly romanticized and frankly false view of alcohol about how great it is. So what can happen is we start to almost get bored of sobriety and start to fantasize about how good our drinking days were. This is exacerbated by something called fading effect bias, which is a universal human trait. And by universal, I mean it is everybody on the planet. It's not just people who are in the West or, in the East or whatever. Everyone, even indigenous tribes out in the Amazon, whatever it is, they all exhibit this trait. And it is essentially to look back on past events more positively than when they happened. No one really knows why we have it. And the prevailing theory is that it just helps humans maintain a more positive outlook on life. But the fact of the matter is, it's there. So on the one hand, you start to take your sobriety for granted, and on the other hand, you're still being bombarded with all the false romantic views of alcohol, along with the fact that fading effect bias kicks in, and you start looking back on your drinking days and thinking they weren't that bad. Actually, I used to really enjoy drinking. All of those together can actually mean that you then go in a dip after you've quit. Now, I am not saying that is post-acute withdrawal syndrome, and I'm not saying it isn't a thing and it doesn't have a chemical background to it. But I think given the fact that some of the symptoms are quite vague and the time periods seem to vary wildly, and the fact that I know a considerable number of people who didn't go through it at all, and generally these tend to be people, in my experience anyway, and I emphasize this is just my experience, who are really positive about their sobriety. I have yet to find someone who really loves sobriety and is really engaged with it and is absolutely happy to have quit alcohol that's had post-acute withdrawal syndrome, which I think is quite interesting. So I think it may be, there may not be a chemical side to it. The alternative is I could be completely wrong. I'm just fishing in the dark here, but there may be, and it may just affect some people rather than others. It's interesting that you say that you've dropped 2 different substances. So it might just be to do with that you feel like you're giving things up, and things are starting to feel a bit empty. So again, I don't mean to be disparaging to anyone who's suffered it, and I might be completely wrong, and I would be interested to hear from you if you've got a different experience. But that is my take on it so far. But I do emphasize I'm not saying this as an absolute fact. This is just some thoughts I have on the subject. Any thoughts on the budget announced this week? I know you're not a huge fan of minimum unit pricing for various reasons, but I thought the new alcohol taxing scale was pretty similar in theory. Personally, it feels right to have a higher tax for a higher volume, but it sounds like some of the lower volume drinks might be set to come down in price, which I think sends the wrong message, even if the pubs have been struggling with the lockdown restrictions. So I suppose my area of expertise, for what it's worth, is more to do with why we drink and why we keep picking up alcohol. And I do genuinely think that the best way to help people, and I include everyone in the country on this, is just to educate people a bit more. A lot of people don't appreciate, for example, the 5 aspects of drag I just talked about. These are things that impact every single drinker, but most people just aren't aware of them. So for me, the best thing to do is to kind of provide the opportunity to give this information to people so that they can better make their own decisions. Because at the end of the day, we can only make good decisions if the information upon which we're basing those decisions is complete and correct. If there's massive holes in that information or it's wrong, we're going to keep making the wrong decisions. I'm not here to tell people to drink or not drink, but I am here to explain to people what happens if they do and what happens if they don't. So yes, I mean, I can see the reason for taxing, and I can see, I've said before, my concern with putting the price of alcoholic drinks up is that people, like smoking, people will find money for drinking and smoking, and indeed other drugs. So if you've got people on a low income, particularly with a family, and you put the alcohol price up, I mean, isn't that just going to mean that they're going to have less money to spend on necessities and their children? That was my concern with it. I don't think there's a right or wrong to it. It's incredibly difficult. And of course, when you're talking about populations, in this country, we're 70, 80 million. In the US, it's 300 million. You can never get it right. You just need to do the best you can for the most number of people. But for me, I just don't think you can go far wrong with educating people and giving them information so they can make their own decisions. November 1st will be 1 year totally alcohol free. Why do I still feel tired most days? I get 8 hours sleep on average. I have energy to work out regularly and do my job, grade school educator, but no energy to socialise. I crave as much downtime as I can get. Will this change with even more time? Will I want to get out more? I suspect this is just my normal energy level for wanting to be with people, but I mask it with drinking. There are still necessary social obligations for my kids' activities and extended family and organisations that I do care about. These feel more effortful now. So there's a few things to say here. A lot of people stop drinking and they feel massively better for it and they go out and everything's great. Some people will stop drinking and they will uncover or be able to shine a spotlight on like an underlying issue that they have. So they may have a mental health issue, depression or anxiety, for example. They may have some kind of childhood trauma that they've not come to grips with. They may have a sleeping problem. So they may not, for various reasons, be able to sleep properly. So my first thought is you may have a sleeping issue. It may be that you get 8 hours of sleep on average, but you might not be going through the sleeping patterns that you need to be going through. And an example of this is when people snore. You can have problems with your sinuses, so that when you fall asleep and start to fall into deeper sleep, you sort of snort a bit. It might not wake you up, but it will disturb your sleeping patterns. So that's my first thought there. You might want to speak to a professional about your sleeping, because that might be an issue. Having said that, it's interesting that you say you've got energy to work out regularly and do your job. So if you're feeling awake and not tired and fairly energetic during the day, it might be as simple as that you don't particularly like socializing, because I find I have a lot of energy for things I want to do. And if it's something I don't want to do, I suddenly feel really lethargic and can't be bothered to get on with it. So it might be that. Now, I appreciate you say here, but social obligations for your kids' activities and extended family and organisations I care about. But you may find you are so there are introverts and extroverts. It's not one or another. It's not black and white. There's a massive grey area. But introverts need more time alone and less time socialising, and extroverts need more time socialising and less time alone. And I've heard it even said that introverts find socialising, even when they enjoy it, tiring and draining, whereas extroverts actually become energized by it. I'm definitely in the introvert category, and I don't particularly like socializing, although I do enjoy it, but I do feel it tiring. Even when I'm enjoying it, after a few hours, I kind of like, I'm glad to get away. So you might just find that you're slightly introverted, and drinking was masking it, in which case you just need to you just need to change things slightly. Do your socializing, but don't try and stay there for like 4 or 5 hours. Just cut the timing down a bit. Sometimes it's useful as well to not socialize in massive groups. So if you can do socializing not in bigger groups but smaller groups, that might help as well. But as I say, it might be worth looking at your sleeping pattern and speaking to someone. But the fact that you've got energy to work out and do your job, and as I say, if you're not feeling tired during the day, it might actually be that you're just a bit more introverted than you were when you were drinking, which is not a bad or unnatural thing. We are all different. A lot of people are introverted. And in fact, I think a lot of people turn to people who are introverted and forced to socialize a lot probably do tend to drink more because they're in a situation they don't find particularly comfortable. And if you're not feeling particularly comfortable, then a sedative and anesthetic is going to take the edge off it. The answer is not alcohol. The answer is to change and maybe reduce your socializing. Just wondered if it might be helpful for people to know that there are smaller support groups out there to help with the journey of sobriety once they understand the importance of changing core beliefs about alcohol. Also, another revisit to socialising and planning ahead for events and parties. I found your tips about seeing it as an experiment so helpful. Also, lots of preparation and leaving early. So absolutely, there are smaller support. So Alcohol Explained, that the Facebook group has got over 15,000 people in it now. It is big. I have limited time for social media, and in fact, I'm trying not to get so bogged down on it because I find it quite a drain a lot of the time anyway. So I am active in the group, but not as active as I used to be. And of course, it's a free group as well. If you want lots and lots of input and support from people, that takes time and people will charge for it. There are a lot of groups out there. The charges aren't big. So Dawn's Sober Fish group, I always recommend that because I know Dawn really well. And I know I'm a member of her group. She's put me in her group, so I know what goes on. It's excellent. It's peanuts. It's less than you spend in a night's drinking for the whole month. But it's small enough that you get that direct support. And of course, there's not just her group. There's loads and loads of groups out there. So if you are struggling, it's definitely worth maybe looking into something just a bit smaller. That might be incredibly helpful. So socializing and planning ahead for social events and parties. What is mentioned there is seeing it as an experiment. So that is, I always found that quite useful. Pretend you're like a spy or a scientist gone to like study these strange and unnatural beings, and watch people when they're drinking, because it's fascinating. If you just go and watch, and this is one of the problems I have with that saying that alcohol is borrowing happiness from tomorrow, because it kind of suggests you get double happiness tonight and then you feel rubbish the next day, but that's not the case. If you watch people for the first hour or so when they've had a few drinks, they do get more energized, they do get more chatty, they do look happier. But of course they do. They're socializing. And when we socialize, our brain releases endorphins that make us feel good. That's nothing to do with the alcohol. The alcohol may trigger it because the way you get the endorphin buzz is by being relaxed and socializing. Now, most people, when they first go to social events, aren't relaxed. You feel a bit self-conscious. You're a bit kind of, and it takes a few minutes of talking to people and losing yourself in a conversation and starting to engage in it before you start to relax and get the endorphin buzz. So if you have a couple of drinks, what that does is anesthetizes the nerves and allows the endorphins to flow, which is another problem because a lot of people genuinely think alcohol makes you feel good. It doesn't, it just makes you feel dulled. But it's because we drink it on social occasions that we experience a good feeling from alcohol, but it's not the alcohol at all, it's the endorphins. So if you watch people when they're drinking, yes, they will look a bit more buoyant because they've got their endorphin rush a bit earlier than you have. But look at them again in 2 or 3 hours' time, particularly after they've finished eating. They start to look dulled, and they certainly don't look any happier than the non-drinkers. And the people that are drinking more, that's when you sometimes get, the arguments and the kind of people start to get a bit aggressive. But as I say, they don't look like they're enjoying themselves particularly. And it's really interesting to watch people. Alcohol isn't borrowing happiness from tomorrow. It's just getting your happiness a minute or two earlier and then losing it all. Because that's the other thing. If you're relaxed and socializing, that endorphin buzz will last the whole evening. But when you're drinking, you start to anesthetize it, which is why the drinkers are often, quite merry and happy at the start of the evening, but then start to become either just kind of normal or more often, maudlin and argumentative towards the end of it, which is a whole separate issue because in the same way that alcohol anesthetizes, it anesthetizes the receptors in our brain that prevent our emotions from running away. So when we drink, we become incapable of regulating our emotions, which is why there's such a huge correlation between alcohol and violence and anger and all the rest of it. And people become really introspective or depressed or crying or angry or violent when they drink. And it's always really, really interesting to watch. The other point there is the leaving early. Don't ever feel you have to stay at a social occasion towards the end. Socializing, talking to other people should be enjoyable. When you're talking to someone who is standing too close, spitting when they talk to you, breathing their foul wine breath all over you, and thinking they're way funnier than they actually are, it's not enjoyable. And unfortunately, that's the reality of socializing with people who are drinking. It's not particularly pleasant. The beauty of currently, there's so many more people quitting. There are now social occasions where you can go out for an entire occasion with people who don't drink, which makes it so much nicer. If you are worrying about a social occasion, so one of the things I say is look for the tipping point. What the tipping point is, it's kind of that point, that targeting that one point where you can change the entire course of a particular event by taking a particular decision with it. Now, what I normally find is, to give an example, going to a social occasion and not drinking is not uniformly difficult all the way through. In my early drinking days, I found the hardest part was turning up and asking for a soft drink. When you've done that, you've almost got over the hump because you're on the soft drink. You're then talking to people with the soft drink in your hand. The decision's made. It just gets easier from there on. So really visualize that first thing. That's the main thing. You just need to get through that. You just need to turn up at a social event and ask for a drink. And this is a good way of looking at it, combined with leaving early. If you're really intimidated by it, just tell yourself you're going to turn up, okay? You're going to order a soft drink, and then you're going to leave as soon as you can't stand it anymore. And if that means knocking that soft drink down in one and going, that is what you will do. What you'll usually find is you'll have that soft drink and you will be able to stand it. You'll be there fine for quite a bit. And as I say, it's particularly interesting if you start studying people when they're drinking and seeing, are these people actually enjoying themselves? Because at the end of the day, the reason we always go back to drinking is because we believe we need it to socialize and it's enjoyable. And if it's neither of those things, what on earth are we bothering with it for? I hope that was useful for everyone. Have a good weekend, everyone. So hopefully next week I will be back to the normal time. And yeah, have a good weekend, and I shall hopefully see you next week. Goodbye.